Good morning, and thank you. My name is Fran Townsend. I'm President Bush's former Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor. Thank you and welcome to UANI's Policy Conference. Today's conference comes at an important moment in the Iran debate, as the Biden administration is finding that Plan A, or the mutual return to compliance with the JCPOA, is turning out to be more challenging than most expected. UANI has been on the front lines of arguing for a Plan B from day one of this administration, and the JCPOA's framework from 2015 does not work, and it is not a durable policy for the United States. One of the reasons why the Biden administration is having such difficulty getting Iran back to the negotiating table is because it has undertaken a maximum deference campaign. All carrots, few sticks. While sanctions remain on the books, sanctions are only as good as the US government's enforcement. And today we are seeing Iran engaging in prohibited transactions with China, Venezuela, and others. Beijing's life support to the Iranian regime is one of the reasons the P5+1 remains at an impasse with Iran over resumption of the nuclear talks. Let's consider the statistics. As of July 2021, since President Biden's election as president, Iran's crude oil exports, most going to China, has skyrocketed, at times reaching almost 1.5 million barrels a day, according to UANI's tanker tracker. This is 3 times more than its lowest point of 500,000 barrels a day after then President Trump reimposed sanctions on Iran. The numbers speak for themselves. UANI has been on the front lines of this challenge. Our researchers monitor the Iran-related tanker traffic through ship and satellite tracking daily and have revealed illicit oil transfers. It has resulted in international registries deflagging multiple vessels. The Iran problem, though, is much broader than these Chinese imports. Iran is not just a part of the nuclear file. There are missiles, drones, terrorism, and human rights-related challenges the regime presents. Iran's drone program is an emerging maritime threat, as we have seen in its attacks on the Mercer Street last summer. That's why US initiatives like the Fifth Fleet's Task Force 59, which support our allies and partners in the region in combating such drones, is so important. But more needs to be done, especially in reestablishing deterrence in the region. Lastly, as former US Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to President Bush, I'd like to touch upon Iran's threat to the United States homeland. The US Justice Department's indictment targeting an Iranian intelligence network, which plotted to kidnap a US journalist and human rights activist, Mahsa al-Najad, from New York City for rendition to Iran, was a chilling reminder that Iran continues to plan operations targeting our homeland. In the State Department's announcement of sanctions against these Iranian agents, Secretary Blinken noted in his statement in September 2021 that beyond this specific plot, the United States remains aware of ongoing Iranian interest in targeting other American citizens, including current and former US officials. This underscores why merely putting the Iran nuclear program back in a box won't resolve the core challenges Washington faces in countering Tehran. Here to discuss this and more with us today is Ambassador Nikki, who is Senior Advisor to United Against Nuclear Iran and has been a national thought leader on the threat from Iran. Ambassador Haley served as US Ambassador to the United Nations in the Trump administration, was the first female governor of South Carolina, and before that served as a member of the South Carolina House of Representatives. She is the founder of Stand for America, an advocacy organization promoting freedom at home and strength abroad. Welcome, Ambassador Haley. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you.
So let's start. You recently wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post arguing that President Biden won't fight China's importing of Iranian oil. If he doesn't do it, Congress should. Given the current composition of Congress, is that practical? Do you think we can get there? Is there enough bipartisan support to take on the fight?
Well, I think we first have to look at the fact that this is a national security issue. The whole reason that we, started sanctioning Iran was because we knew all of the money was going to terrorist activity. We knew it was going to nuclear production. We knew it was going to all things that promoted their thoughts of death to America, death to Israel. and we needed to stop it. And I think what you're seeing now is sanctions are only as good as if we hold countries accountable. If you have, these massive oil exports happening from Iran to China, and you're allowing China to help Iran, that's a problem for us. The idea that we're not calling them out, the idea that we're not holding them accountable, the idea that we're not, raising flags in the international community about how China is doing this is a real problem. China made a massive deal with Iran because in their mind, they want to prop up an enemy of the United States because it helps China to do so. We have to be willing to call it out when it happens. And I think the idea that we're allowing this cash flow to go from China to Iran is nothing more than just more of a threat to America and more of a threat to our friends as well.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's interesting to me. China originally supported U.S. sanctions and has turned around. Do you see that as part of the great power competition between the United States and China? And how do we push China to do exactly what you've suggested?
Well, I think that China is now in a different form of strategy. And that strategy is not unlike Russia, which is you tend to hold hands with those that are against America as opposed to working with America to do something. And I think China sees it's in their best interest. If there's a country out there saying death to America, China wants to be a part of helping them. And that's what we see happen. You wouldn't have seen this a few years ago with China going and associating with Iran, but they find that it benefits them to do so. And so that's all the more reason why we need Congress to step up and say, look, this is the time. If we don't stand up now, more is going to happen later, and that'll be more dangerous.
So tell me, you mentioned Russia. Do you think they're more vulnerable to our influence or our ability to push them away from China and Iran and more towards our policy view?
Well, what happened and what really hurt us was really the way we handled Afghanistan, because it dictated the tone of how countries would treat us. It's not that we don't have leverage that we could be using against China and Russia. It's the fact that we're not using those points and they're not scared of us anymore. That's the reality. When you allow Iranian tankers to export oil to China and you don't do anything about it, that sends a message. When you go and have the debacle in Afghanistan that shows that we're short-sighted and we're not going to actually act on terrorism, that sends a message. When you go and cave to Nord Stream 2 and put Ukraine in harm's way and allow Russia to get what they want, that sends a message. And bottom line is, the message is they're not scared of anything that the US is going to do. So they're going to take advantage of everything they can to weaken the US, while they're at it. I think this is a great opportunity for Congress to step up and do what President Biden won't. And that's to start to assert itself, start to let everyone know, our friends, our allies, our enemies, that Iran is a threat, and we're going to do everything we need to stop them from doing that.
So it's been 5 months since they've been at the negotiating table in Vienna, and the US is having problems getting them back to the negotiating table. But the EU and the United States seem to just be sitting back and waiting. What do you think that ought to be happening to push them back to the negotiating table? And by the way, is the JCPOA even relevant anymore?
It's such a sign of weakness that we are letting Iran dictate when we meet, how we meet, if we do anything. I mean, the fact that Biden's falling all over himself to do business with Iran is that's such a weak moment for America. And I think that what we really have to look at is, if we want to get everyone on board, if we really want to right the ship, you can't really refer to the same Iran deal that was dealt with in 2015, because it's seen as Obama's baby. And as long as it's seen as Obama's baby, you're going to have it be more of a partisan issue. So Republicans are not going to like the Iran deal. Democrats are going to feel like they have to defend it because it was Obama's deal. And the reality is, we've got to start looking at Iran and see that the situation has progressed. The partners that we had, are not the strongest partners we need to have. If we're going to do this, okay, fine, let's get the Europeans, but what about the Arab countries who feel the threat of Iran every day? That's the part that's missing. If we really want to get a bipartisan effort and we really want to do this in an effective way, let's get our Arab partners, let's get the Europeans, and let's let Iran know, forget the JCPOA. That's in the past. If there's going to be a deal, it's going to be one that's going forward, and it's not going to be with carrots. It's going to be the fact with they have to stop all nuclear production. They have to allow oversight over everything that they're doing, and they have to start being a good actor. You can't change a country's culture overnight. The Iranian regime will continue to be one that, as long as they're saying death to America, that's going to continue to show what their mission is and what they're trying to do. We really have to change the way we address them instead of waiting for them to change the way they address us. That's the only way we'll get the upper hand, and that's the only way we'll start to move forward with this.
You mentioned the Arab countries. There's been rumor, sort of an open secret, that there have been meetings among the GCC countries with the Iranians, including the Saudis. What would you look for? What are the signals that that's making some progress? And what do you take from that we're not a part of it?
It's interesting because in the Trump administration, that never would have happened. And the reason it wouldn't have happened is because really when President Trump met with the Arab Summit, he basically said, let's all get together in the name of defeating terrorism. It was code for let's all get together in the name of defeating Iran. It got the Arab community's attention, and all of a sudden they thought, well, maybe there is a friend, because they have all felt it, whether it's dealing with the Houthis in Yemen, whether it's dealing with, Hezbollah in Lebanon, whether it's dealing with Hamas in Gaza, Syria and Iraq. They have felt it, and they feel the threat every day, and they were looking for a partner. And that's where we saw things come together. It's where we started to see the Abraham Accords. It's where we started to see some other things, because they felt like we possibly could be a country they could trust, and we could be a country that could be a friend. When Biden came in, the first thing he did was send signals that he wanted to get back into the Iran deal. That set the Arab countries back, but also by refusing to meet with the crown prince in Saudi Arabia. That was a terrible strategic mistake. Regardless of what Biden's views were on Saudi Arabia, that's a partner we need to have in defeating terrorism. So once that happened, you sent Saudi Arabia into the arms of Iran. The idea that there's actually having conversations and negotiations was unthinkable a couple of years ago. And so, I think that the first thing we have to do is say, look, this is not a time to judge those Arab countries on what they do and what they don't do. We should always have our views on what we think is right. But this is a time to realize that terrorism is a serious issue. The Iran deal is something we should never want to go back to. We should never go and give concessions to Iran and play on their terms. But what we need to do is be really having communications with our Arab partners and say, what do you think we should do going forward? And how do we best help you? Because you look at the Arab partners, you look at Israel. Israel now is contemplating for the first time having to deal with Iran without us. I mean, that's an unbelievable scenario that and they're not wrong to do that. If I was advising Israel, I would say, don't count on the Biden administration to help you with Iran, because I don't think they're going to be there. And so, I think what you're seeing is countries are now taking actions on their own because they just can't count on the United States anymore. And all that does is weaken us in the eyes of the world. It strengthens our enemies, and it shows that other countries are finding us to not be as credible and relevant as we once were.
So we have a very interesting question from the audience. I'll just read it to you. Ambassador Haley, we see Iran increasingly testing the US and Iraq and Syria in the form of drone attacks on US bases, most recently Al Tanaf Air Base in Syria. But since the attack on Al Tanaf, there has not been a US response aside from piecemeal sanctions on Iran's drone program. What should the US response be to counter these activities?
Very telling. Not very telling to the US, very telling to those that want to defeat the US. But this is a trend. This is a trend we've been seeing from the Biden administration. When Russia hacked us, it was not Russia trying to hurt us. It was Russia trying to test us. What happened? Nothing. We didn't do anything about it. When China has continued to go and help Iran and violate sanctions, what did we do? Nothing. It was a test of China, and they're going to continue to do that going forward. You know, what happened when they all saw what we did on Afghanistan? They saw us cave. It showed that we're never going to show any force. It gave them reasons not to be fearful of us. And, you know, you look at when we caved on Nord Stream 2, you know, what did that tell Russia? You know what, you've got 4 years to do whatever you want to do. And I think we're going to continue to see Russia do that. And then you look at this drone strike on our airbase in Syria. This once again sent a message. These are all tests. These are not meant to be huge shots across the bow at us. These are all tests because they used to be scared of us, and they want to make sure that if they do something, that we're not going to have a big response. We're feeding right into their hands with this, and we're letting them know, take advantage of this time because America's asleep at the wheel and they're not going to do anything about any of the actions you take against them.
You know, you mentioned we have to get Congress to take action where the administration is failing to do so. I'd be interested, what are the elements of a more comprehensive deal that would garner bipartisan support? It doesn't seem like anybody can agree on anything in Washington at the moment. So what would that deal need to look like? So it wasn't Obama's baby, but it did have bipartisan support.
Well, I think if we look at this, if we go into this on not whose administration is doing it, but do this as what's America going to do about it? The first thing you want to say is, what's the threat? The threat is the nuclear production. So we have to stop the nuclear production, flatten its tracks, not consider any release of sanctions, start having serious conversations with, you know, first, what do we want? We want the nuclear production to stop. Okay, who do we want with us? We want the Arab partners, we want Israel, we want our allies to all be in this. Have a conversation with them on, this is what we want to do. How do you see the path forward, and start to do that? And then the third part is verification. You know, one of the things we did when the president was looking to get out of the Iran deal, I asked him if I could go to Vienna to the IAEA to talk to them about whether this was working or not, because there really was, you know, the will of not just get out of it because Obama got into it, but look at it and say, is it working, and what part is working and what part's not? President Trump let me do that so that I could come back and prove that we needed to make changes to the deal. And when I got to the IAEA, I asked a lot of questions, and the questions were, okay, how do you assess Iran? You know, we know that there's a lot of nuclear research that's being done in the universities. Have you gone and looked at the universities? And the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, said, no, we don't look at the universities. Those are off limits. They don't allow us to see that. Okay, well, we know a lot of the nuclear production is happening in the military installations. How often are you looking at the military installations? Their answer was, Iran's not letting us look at the military installations. Those are off limits. So then I said, okay, you're not looking at the research universities, you're not looking at the military installations. What exactly are you looking at? And they said, well, we get tips. We have, you know, some signals of where the nuclear production is happening. And so when we see that, those are the ones that we target. And I said, okay, what's the process when you target a vulnerable issue that you think we have to investigate? They said, well, we contact the regime. We let them know that they have 45 days before we come to inspect. Well, you know, it's common sense that 45 days is enough for the regime to go and clear out anything from any warehouse and not do it. And that's when I came back to President Trump and I said, you have every reason to get out of this deal because this deal has no teeth to it. And, you know, that's the part that we have to really do is when you allow our enemy to dictate the terms of whether they're being a honest and trustworthy actor, you've already lost. And so we have to go and make sure that we and our partners go and have a viable mechanism that we truly can monitor if there's any production. And after you do the verification, then it's what you do to keep them honest. If you're going to do sanctions, what the punishment's going to do, how the punishment's going to be put out, and what you do to violators of those. So, it's basically 4 easy steps that can be handled that will really allow you to get this at bay, but it does take everyone being at the table. It does take honest conversation. And it also says, if you're going to do this, you have to be willing to follow through with it, or else no one's going to take you seriously. And so I think you start over. And I think that's the way you get bipartisan effort, because Republicans and Democrats alike want to see Iran stopped. Republicans and Democrats alike want to see the world safer. And I think that when we go with good intentions of this not being about the personality or the administration that's doing it, but about making the world safer, that's when you get bipartisan support.
So you mentioned about from administration to administration. I'd say to you, I think one of the weaknesses is Iran understands they make a deal with one administration and that changes after a presidential election with the next administration. What do we need to do to ensure durability of our Iran policy beyond every 4 years, the next person changing it?
Well, it's the reality of America, right? I mean, unless it's a treaty, what you're going to see is every president has the opportunity to do that. That's not necessarily a bad thing because, for example, President Obama put the Iran deal in place. I think they were well intentioned and had good reason to think that this was going to work. You do want every president to go back and look at a plan and say, is it still working? That is something we need to do. But when something's not working, you drop it, but then you say, okay, what are we going to do instead? And, this is about being flexible. This is about changing with the times. The most important thing we do is, instead of talking about deals and administrations, the message that should be sent to Iran is the consistency in our message that whether you're Republican or Democrat, we're not going to allow you to threaten our allies. We're not going to allow you to have nuclear production. We're not going to allow you to support terrorism. We're not going to allow you to sell arms to bad actors. These are messages that should not be partisan. These are messages that any administration from one to the next could do. So, this isn't just with Iran. I strongly believe that we have to have consistent foreign policy that is America based, not Republican based, not Democrat based, but America based. And when you get that, that's the consistency you send to the rest of the world that, one, we value human rights. We don't think that we should allow bad actors to have nuclear arms like North Korea or Iran. We are going to continue to fight terrorism everywhere that we see it and make sure that we keep Americans safe. All of those messages, if they continue to be said regardless of the administration, and if they continue to be followed through with action regardless of the administration, that's how we'll get our game back. That's how we'll start to be consistent.
Pastor Haley, when you were in office, you were a real force. You were a real leader on the Iran issue. And the United States was a leader, frankly, and it led the path sort of against Iran. How do we get better support, or more support, frankly, and more consistent support from our European allies who have not always been themselves very consistent or very supportive?
Well, sometimes we have to give our allies a spine, that's for sure. And I think I saw that at the United Nations. They're great brothers and sisters and allies of ours, but when you need to buck their spine, you got to buck it, and you have to let them know that we're not going to allow them to shake. And I think that happened. I had to deal with that, whether it was dealing with Iran, whether it was dealing with North Korea, whether it was dealing with chemical weapons in Syria, whether it was dealing with an Israeli-Palestinian issue. When I felt the Europeans were getting weak in the knees, I would go and buck them up and say, look, we're in this together and I need you to be strong, or don't stand with me. And, it's tough love that you have to give to your friends and your allies when you're in a situation like that. One of the things that I found really interesting at the United Nations was, whether it was the Europeans or Israel or any of our friends, whenever they were nervous about something or whenever anything was wrong, they'd come running to me and say, can you do this? And I would always say, you do it. I'll have your back when you do it. It's important that America doesn't always have to be the leader. Sometimes it's good to let our friends lead so that they can find their voice, they can find their spine, they can find their strength, and then do that. But in the situation with Iran, the frustrating part of that was, put the Iran deal aside. if you took that out, which the EU was very wedded to it and didn't want anyone to criticize it, and stood down on it because they had done it and they just didn't want to be called wrong. That was part of the problem. But the other part of the problem was we had UN resolutions that Iran was in total violation of. They were supporting terrorism. That was a violation. They were selling arms, which was a violation. They weren't supposed to be doing that. They were testing ballistic missiles. That was a violation. My comment to the Europeans was, this isn't about the Iran deal. They're violating multiple UN resolutions. If you won't stand up to this, what makes you think they're going to honor the Iran deal? That was the problem I had with the Europeans. They wouldn't even call out Iran on the violations of UN resolutions, and neither would the other 192 countries at the United Nations. And so, what we have to remember is we have to call it out, even if that means calling it out alone sometimes. I mean, I always thought that was really important. I thought it was important to say what America was for, what America was against, and stand strong with that. It didn't matter whether they liked me. It was very important that they respected America. And the way you get respect is by being consistent and by having courage and by standing up and not needing friends to do it. Because the one thing I found is when America leads, the world follows. When America speaks, the world listens. And what America is, the world wants. We have to use our voice. We have to use our stances. We have to use our strength in what we do to really show the world that we can get to a better place. And that includes toughening up the spines of our friends, and the Europeans often get weak in the knees on that.
Yeah, are there particular things you think we could do in terms and negotiating a deal that would be more attractive to the Europeans or incentivize the Europeans to be more vocal, more supportive?
I think the way that you get the Europeans to be more vocal and to really strengthen their spine is when you pull in the Arab community. The Europeans feel better when they don't feel alone. They need a support group. They need friends. They need to feel like they're part of something. And so, if we were to just have Israel, that's not enough for the Europeans. To have the Arab community go in there too, the Europeans would be right there. And then when you do that, guess what? You have the Arab community, you have the European Union. That's when you go and you get the rest of the world, because they see these strong voting blocs. They see these strong investors in, what's happening to Iran. And that's when you get movement. And so it's really about addition. We need to add more to our coalition. We don't need to lose members. And in order to add to our coalition, you don't go and expect the Arab community to be with us. You go and you talk about the threats that Iran is posing on the Arab community, and you let them know what they think we should be doing, and okay, how are you going to be invested in it? That's actually what's going to bring the Europeans back in play.
Yeah. So, UANI has been quite forceful, as have you, saying that the original JCPOA was too narrowly focused. Yes, the nuclear issue is the preeminent issue, but it failed to address drones and missiles and terrorism and human rights violations. How do you pull those things in, which are so important in terms of moving forward with Iran?
Well, I think you first have to acknowledge, and not a lot of people talk about this, is what was the mission of the Iran deal? I had a conversation with Secretary Kerry one time, because obviously he was very wedded to the Iran deal. I strongly opposed the Iran deal. And, I told him, I said, look, this isn't about, criticism of you. This isn't about criticism of the administration. This is about criticism of the fact that a deal that was well-intentioned wasn't working anymore. And so our goal was, okay, how do we get it to work? And I said, you had to know that when you went and sent 2 planes full of money to Iran, that this was only going to appease them for a short amount of time, because even within 6-7 years, they were going to be back at it again. And Secretary Kerry admitted in a room full of people that this was not an attempt to stop Iran. This was an attempt to stall Iran. There's a big difference in stopping and stalling. What that did was kick the can down the road for another administration to have to deal with it. So don't complain when another administration does deal with it. If we're ever going to truly deal with Iran, the mission has to be to stop them, not to stall them, not to appease them. It's to stop them. And the only way you're going to stop them is when you take the revenues that allow them to do nuclear production and you put the verification in place that will call out the production when we see it. And then you have penalties ready to go from the international community, not one country, not the US, that really goes and puts that down. When that happens, that's how you stop Iran and changing it from a conversation of stalling.
You know, I've understood, if not disagreed, but I understand that the international community has been able to ignore the threat of the Houthis backed by Iran because the Houthis are really a discrete threat to Saudi Arabia. Now, that's not a reason to ignore it, but I do think that the world has not paid a lot of attention. What I've never understood is there not more attention and more support and rallying around the fact that they're the single largest state sponsor of terrorism and the money they pour into Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a threat in Europe, it's a threat in the United States and South America. It's around the world and nobody's for it, but nobody really has had, to use your phrase, the spine to stand up and make it a real issue. How do we do that? How do we bring more attention and get more support for the fact that we can't allow Iran to continue to be the world's largest state sponsor of terror?
I think it would be really important to follow the money. You know, when they got those 2 planes of cash in an attempt to rein Iran in, what did they do with it? They funneled money to the Houthis, which did cause problems within Yemen, which led to massive, we're seeing the starvation and everything happening in Yemen. Yes, that's a smaller fight with the Saudis and at one time the Emiratis, but it was an issue. Look at Hezbollah. Look at the ammunition fueling with Hezbollah in Lebanon and throughout the world in all of those areas. Look at Hamas and what they did to Gaza. What Iran did was they literally funneled cash to every bad actor in the world that would support terrorism. That affected so many countries, from Africa to, the Gulf countries to, you look at America, you look at Israel, all of those countries were affected. If we showed the historical aspect of following the money to the world and showed those lines of funding and the death toll and the chaos that was caused from it, the world would take notice. This is something we have to take more effort to communicate, more time to show what happened. When you show that, it's like elementary school. You take the first dollar, you show what happened, you show the ammunition, you show the nuclear buildup, you show the deaths that occurred, and you show the lines to the entire world on how that money fueled. That's the answer. This is the conversation of I saw this many times at the UN. Anytime there was a vote, a country would look at it as, well, does it affect me? It's interesting. There was a lot of criticism about America first. Actually, every country does their own country first. Their first question is, does it affect me? If it doesn't affect them, then they try and stay out of the situation. If it affects one of their friends, they try and stay as little in the situation as they have to be and not cause any waves. The truth is, it affects every country. And so when you look at them being the number one state sponsor of terrorism, everyone is feeling that right now. And if we were to go and show that and show how every country has been affected, and then you go and show who are the countries propping up Iran. Oh, by the way, it's China. Oh, look at Venezuela. Oh, look at these other countries that are all aligning with them. That's how you get something to happen. But it's hard work to do that. It's hard communication to do that, but it's that important. We have to do it. These aren't, deals where you put 5 people in a room and say, come up with something and tell everybody it's great. You have to have people invested. You have to have countries invested. And terrorism is worth investing in to make sure that we counter that. I think it's hugely important.
I'd like to remind the audience, there's an ask button on your screen. If you'd like to ask a question of Ambassador Haley, please click on that button and ask your question and they'll get it to me. I'm happy to ask those questions. I wanted to ask about human rights. It's not been at the top of the policy list, but I have to tell you, it strikes me that the Biden administration has made a huge issue, understandably so, of the Uyghurs with China, but we don't hear anything about the human rights violations in Iran. And when you look at it, Iran and Turkey, frankly, they're Iranian allies. They kill more journalists than any countries around the world, and we never hear anything about that. Why is that? Why that inconsistency? And why not bring more attention to those human rights abuses?
I think, America has to get out of the, situation where we cherry pick things we don't like and, look at the entire situation. I mean, first of all, I think human rights should always be something we fight for in every country, whether it's with a partner we work with or not. We should never shy away from seeing and saying something when we see human rights. I actually think Biden hasn't been strong enough on the Uyghurs in China and could actually do more. But when it comes to Iran, the sad part about Iran is we have to continue to remind the world that Iranians don't want what's happening in Iran right now. It's the Iranian regime that's really doing all of this. The Iranian people want a better life. We've seen it with the protests. We've seen it with things that they're trying to do to say that this is not what we want. This is not what we want to be a part of. Their voices actually need to be heard. When you look at that, you're not talking about a country of people who are, in support of terrorism. You're talking about a regime that has a stranglehold on their people that are trying to go and spread terrorism, and they're using Iran as a base to do it. And so, I think that, you look at these other countries, whether it's what they do to journalists, whether it's the fact, you look at Iran's not just doing it to journalists. They have, targets on many of us that served in the administration that fought back on Iran and have issued threats to all of us. And so I think that, Iran wants to, one, use scare tactics. Two, they're not afraid to use their thuggish ways of doing things, and they like to make examples of people. And they tend to continue to use the fear factor, and they use fear factor not on other countries, but they also use the fear factor on their own people. And so there are massive human rights situations within Iran. And if you look at the regime, it's easy to make a sell to the rest of the world on how dangerous Iran is and how dangerous they are, to humankind around the world, but how dangerous they are to their own people. And I think that, we could get that. But what I saw at the UN is countries are scared. They're scared that if they speak out about Iran, much like we're seeing about China now, they think if they speak out against Iran, that Iran will come after them. And they're not wrong. If they go and start calling out human rights abuses in Iran, or they start calling out, that Iran is doing bad things, what does Iran do? They go and they make sure that a base is blown up. They go and make sure there's a drone attack. They go and send a message in some kind of way. And their tactics have worked. What we have to do is make sure that we have a coalition that says, if you do this, we're all in this together and we're going to make sure you stop. It's actually pretty interesting that, if you look at what happened with one of the best things President Trump did was killing Soleimani. It literally left Iran flat-footed. He was one that basically told them who to kill, when to kill, how to kill. And the second he was taken, that left the Ayatollahs flat-footed. They literally didn't know what to do. And there was no number two. That was an opportunity to be seized. We should have doubled down on that. We should have really kind of taken advantage of that situation, because did you hear any other country in the world complain when Soleimani was killed? They didn't. They were quietly all cheering and celebrating. And so we forget what that American strength looked like. And we forget how powerful that American strength was, because it totally disarmed, a regime that had done so much wrong in the world, and it suddenly left them very vulnerable. And if we could do it once, we could do it again. And boy, was the world cheering us on when we did that.
Absolutely. And it took real courage, because I know in the policy community there was concern that there would be retaliation, and you always get that, right, from the naysayers. And so it took real courage on the part of the administration to go forward with that, and we didn't see that retaliation. And certainly the world is a safer place without him.
You see so many times in foreign policy that a lot of the policy world will say the sky is going to fall if you do something. And what I've seen time and time again is, when you do what's right, we saw this when it was acknowledging that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel and moving our embassy to the capital. When you go and you pull out of the Iran deal, when you go and you call things out like that, everyone will say that the sky is going to fall. The sky is still up there. It doesn't fall. It takes courage. And usually you find not only does the sky not fall, you get friends, because you're doing something that others were scared to do as well. And they see that when you do it, it works, and you have more allies coming along with you.
So we have another question from the audience. Ambassador Haley, today, Iran is commemorating the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran by student militants. By student militants. We are seeing crowds gathered throughout Tehran today with posters protesting both former President Trump and President Biden. Do you see any possibility for a more productive relationship with the Islamic Republic under this regime when there is such enmity?
Well, I think, everyone needs to be on alert, because we know that Iran loves to use anniversaries to remind the rest of the world what happened. I think that you have to look at, the Iranian regime, the IRGC, these are not good actors. And as long as they are leading, as long as they are in power, the world is less safe. It's just the reality. And, it's one of the things that we all know. It's one of the things that when you take out someone like Soleimani, when you go and you take out one of their leaders, that's how you end up, really making a difference. And what you don't want them to do is get so powerful, so arrogant, so full of thinking that everyone is scared of them and not going to do something, that they continue to pose those threats on the world. And you have to keep their power at bay in whatever way that we have to do that. At one time it was killing Soleimani. Another time it might be, striking back when they do something, like when they do a drone strike. We need to, every time they do a negative act, there needs to be a response, and a stronger response, and a stronger counter. That's the only way we're going to overcome this.
So another question from the audience. Ambassador Haley, can you please address the EU's failure to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization? The EU only blacklists its military wing, but not its political wing, a distinction that Hezbollah itself even rejects. How can the US convince the EU to sanction Hezbollah in its entirety?
It's interesting because, when we were at the UN for the very first time, it was a huge win for us. We were able to get the majority of countries to acknowledge that Hamas was a terrorist organization. And it had been decades in the making. I mean, it's just something they are not strong about doing. You have to fight and fight and fight. The same thing with Hezbollah. I mean, if you look at Hezbollah just on the border of Lebanon, the amount of ammunition, the ability of what they could do to Israel, the ability of what they could do around the world is something that's not talked about near enough. We have to start having the same conversations, the same way we went and pushed Hamas in the face of everyone. We've got to push what Hezbollah is doing in the face of every country and say, you either stand with us or you stand with Hezbollah. That's really how we did it. It's the same thing with North Korea. We were getting the sanctions packages against North Korea. No one wanted to call them out, even though they were testing ballistic missiles. Everyone said, well, that's Japan, that's South Korea, that's not us. And, basically what we went and did was, I approached it in the way that when I was going to the Security Council is, look, this is real easy. If you don't want war on the peninsula, which is going to affect the rest of the world, then you need to, acknowledge North Korea. And Russia was my holdout. And the way that I ended up getting Russia was pick a side. You're either with holding hands with Kim Jong-un and North Korea, or you're going to stand there with us. And they chose us. It's the same thing. Countries need to say either you're going to hold hands with Hezbollah, or you're going to stand with the peace-loving countries that refuse to do that. When they're given that ultimatum, when you put it to them like that, that's how we get them to acknowledge it. Europeans included. Europeans can be tough sometimes, but we have to give them that ultimatum. And it's not just the European Union. You actually have to go to the people of the European countries, because they will be with us. The European Union is a different animal in itself. You've got this bureaucracy in Brussels that makes all the decisions by themselves, but that's not necessarily how the people of those countries feel. And so the communication has to trickle down into those other countries who are very much feeling terrorism in multiple ways.
Another audience question. Ambassador, after more than 4 decades of the Islamic Republic threatening America and abusing its own people with no change whatsoever, isn't it time for US policy to consider more seriously supporting the Iranian people's movement for democracy and overthrowing the Islamic regime? How would you advise the administration to give greater support to the Iranian people themselves?
Well, I'm all for giving support to the Iranian people. It's not so much what you do is how you do it. Case in point, Afghanistan. It's not so much whether, the fact that Biden wanted to get out of Afghanistan, if that was his call, he could do it. It was how he did it. It was such a blunder. And so when you talk about overtaking the Iranian regime, one, that's not something the US needs to do alone. We need to have partners and come together. And it's something that if you're going to do it, you better do it right and you better win. And so that requires a lot of conversations, a lot of planning, a lot of strategy. And to be honest, my concern right now is our intelligence community. I am very, very concerned about the quality of the intelligence community, about the base of what they're able to do. I worked with many people in the intelligence community and will tell you, you've got the smartest minds and the greatest people in there, but something has to give. It has become very archaic. It's become very bureaucratic. And I don't know that it's really up to par to keep us safe, because you look at the fact, how does 9/11 happen? How does the Iraq war happen? How does Afghanistan falling happen? How does the hypersonic missiles in China happen? Where was our intelligence community? And we need to start paying attention to that, because before we take on anything of any significance with our allies, we better make sure that the intelligence on the ground that we have is right. Because I think not enough has been said about, are we getting good intel? What are we not doing that have allowed these blunders? And how do we go modernize it? When you modernize your military, you modernize your weapons, you modernize your technology, you modernize your innovation. Well, intelligence is pretty much the same thing. You have to modernize your tactics. You have to modernize the way we collect. You have to modernize the friends we collect it with. And I have great concern about that. So before we take on any new challenge, I would advise the administration to say, look at your intelligence community, talk to those intelligence officers on the ground and ask them, what is going on? Because something seriously must be going on.
Ambassador Haley, you were a strong voice during the administration. You've continued to be a strong national voice. We at UANI are thrilled to work with you. And I have to say, you're such an inspiration. I'll speak for myself. I hope we see you in national office. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. I am such a fan of UANI. It does amazing things with great policies. And I think together we can really start to right the ship. Thanks so much. It was a great conversation.
Thank you. And thank you to the audience for joining us.